We are back with an incredible guest today on the Geographic Profiler. Thank you, STS Nation, for watching on YouTube and listening on your favorite audio platforms. Today, I am speaking with Tim Pappa. Tim is a cyber deception theorist and practitioner, a certified former FBI profiler, and a behavioral content creator for cold cases. Tim has pioneered documentary content on victims and offenders. Tim and I first met on Surviving the Survivor to discuss the case of Rachel Morin. We both consulted separately for the family and visited the Monpaw Trail. Tim is continuing to assist and support the family as the trial of Victor Martinez Hernandez proceeds. Tim, I really want to get into your work in behavioral content creation and discuss Rachel's case. But first, I would like to touch on some of the other work you do and how you got to where you are. I looked at your LinkedIn profile, and you've got a very impressive background from the CIA to the DIA to FBI and now into the private sector and as an educator. So where did it all begin for you?
Thanks for having me on the show, Doug. I think it all began for me in high school when I started working on the high school newspaper, because I found that I really like to write. I like what I read in certain older works, like how things were described and how that made me feel. So I thought I want to be a journalist, and I went to school for journalism at Ohio University, and that's the degree I got, and I had plans in mind that I wanted to be a foreign correspondent. I did a lot of investigative journalism, which really appealed to me because it gave me an opportunity to look into stories that people didn't seem that they wanted to share, or things that they were trying to hide, or there was fraud somewhere, or anything like that. The first investigative story that I had that got a lot of response and won an award was there were a number of college students that had been dying in these car accidents because they had run into or been hit by coal trucks. And so up in this area, the Midwest, in West Virginia and Ohio and around there, would be a lot of coal trucks traveling through those highways. And what they were finding is that coal companies weren't sticking to the regimen for weight. So they were overloading the coal trucks. So the coal trucks weren't stopping on time. They were too heavy, and they were getting into these accidents, which were devastating because people were getting killed. So there were college students that had gone to a nearby university, and it was all very graphic in terms of how they died. I mean, they essentially suffocated, and their lungs were full of coal. And this gave me an opportunity. I wasn't trying to capitalize on that, but I was trying to bring these stories of loss to people because I thought, well, this actually changed something. I started to have those experiences, and this was the first time too that I got to experience. If I write something, if I create something with a story, and it shares a part of people that's very vulnerable, and it shares a part of people that includes a lot of affect and emotions, people respond to it. So that was really clinching me in that respect in terms of the storytelling part of it. I think it's always appealed to me too, because my older brother, we grew up really into movies. That's still something we really connect on. So storytelling has always been a natural thing for us. He's a screenwriter, and he makes small films, and this is just something that we've always kind of come back to. And so in terms of storytelling, that continued through graduate school. I did research, even my time in the government. A lot of the work you do comes down to, can you tell a story well in terms of what's happening, and can you frame this so that people understand what's happening and the impact on people? I don't think I was walking around explicitly thinking I'm a storyteller with these cases and so forth, but those experiences introduced me to it. And I found in research and in my career later on with the FBI, when I was with the Behavioral Analysis Unit, when I started creating content again, the same kind of principles seem to apply, which is if you want to create content that people really respond to and content that they want to share and that it drives behaviors in them, you got to have content where people are vulnerable and it induces affect. So I kind of see that same formula happening again. It's just over a period of time I built onto that model, I guess you could say, when I would use it in different ways in my investigations. And it ultimately led me to behavioral content creation, which is which is not only an investigative technique, but it's also a different kind of approach to storytelling about what's going on in a family or what's going on with victims or different ways to communicate to people you're trying to reach. And in cases like this with Rachel Morin, until we knew who the alleged killer was, it was about trying to reach him and trying to reach his family members, whoever they were, with that same kind of model, right? That they can see that the family that's been affected by this is vulnerable and they're hurting, and that there are places where they can actually connect on that might actually drive people's decision making. That's not an exact science, but the research literature is there to say generally this is how people respond to that kind of content. And so, what I've been trying to do near the tail end of my career in the FBI and even now is really refine that process because the goal is always to try and bring justice for a family when they've lost somebody. That's kind of been the general path of storytelling and experiencing what seems to work with people and then really trying to be instrumental in how I craft it.
So we know where your YouTube channel name comes from. I was going to ask that at some point. The
Mhm.
storyteller design makes sense now.
Yeah.
Uh, I think that's great that you were able to take something that you're passionate about, something that you have with your brother as well, and you were to turn that into a career after. And I noticed that you also had, is it a master's in Southeast Asian studies?
Yeah. I went to
Where does
school.
that come into play?
Yeah. So, I went to school at Ohio University for journalism, and I stayed there right into a graduate program. And it was near the tail end of my time at as an undergraduate. I played ice hockey at Ohio University, and I had my second to last year. I had a knee injury, and it just was it caused complications all through the season. When I came back my last year, I had not recovered and rehabbed that in a way that really made me fit playing the team. I didn't play the last year, and it opened up a lot of free time. So I thought, let me take a strange language or something like that because I thought maybe that's something I want to do, like Peace Corps or something like that. And at that school, Ohio University in Athens, Ohio, they had a very large population of students from Southeast Asia, in particular Indonesia, and a lot of strong professors rooted in that kind of study. So I started meeting them because I started taking Indonesian, um, and getting to know like the things that they were focused on, and that started to really shape my trajectory to this point, even of being a researcher too, and really focusing on communication, which is still an extension of journalism and storytelling, but communication, like how do people influence audiences and how do ideas and narratives spread, right? And
Mhm.
so I started looking at Islamic boarding schools in Indonesia specifically, and this would have been like 2005, 2004, 2005, a few years after 9/11. And as a journalism student, I was, keenly looking at how Muslim communities in particular are portrayed in the media and looking at how they're labeled and characterized. And so a lot of my time and attention was put on how Islam is characterized. And my research was focused on if I go to Indonesia and I live in these Islamic boarding schools and shadow proselytizers around, specifically proselytizers who are progressive minded. I want to see, like, do they actually have a network? And if they have a network, how do they build that network? And so I did go do that. I mean, I've tried to stay consistent on a form of research and practice where I just go do it, right? To experience what that's like. And so I spent about 9 months in Indonesia in grad school doing research, living in these Islamic boarding schools and shadowing these proselytizers. And that was a transformative experience for me for sure, because up until that point, writing stories, doing investigative journalism, I think that it's still difficult to do as like a 20-year-old or 21-year-old. And that experience in Indonesia really pushed me outside my comfort zone, because as many years as I had been studying Indonesian, once I was immersed in a very rural area in Indonesia, I was really on my own, and that was overwhelming at times, of just being brought different places. I'm like, "You should talk to this person or that person." I'm not prepared at all. I'm doing the interviews and like probably pretty poor Indonesian, um, but he was getting by, and with a collection of money that I pulled together to save in like small grants, and that experience was eye opening, because once again, I got to see what happens in situations where you have somebody who has a role in a community, but they're known to be very progressive. And how does that work in communities that are known to be very conservative, who on paper wouldn't agree with this guy? So, how is it that he connected with people? How is it that he influenced them? And why was he so popular? And I get to see that up front. And, there's a lot of research out there about the cues that people look for, and how they find people to be credible. And it to me, it wasn't just someone being charismatic, and a lot of them were, but it was more than that. And I would see him repeat this process pretty much every night, where there's these traditional Islamic processes of the proselytizers going to different towns, villages, communities, and meeting with local officials for an hour or two before and sharing food, then coming out and speaking, then repeating that process again. So I'd see the friendship and network building and maintenance of it. But with the crowds, it was the way he was dressed and the way he spoke and the fact that he had already gone on the Hajj. And so he instantly had credibility and authority because of his role. But then I'd hear him like start singing songs, kind of like oldies but goodies, and the crowd would finish the lyrics for him. He was funny. He told a lot of jokes. Women thought he was attracted, this one in particular. So I'd see this connection happening on all these levels. And then he'd get into some pretty vulnerable topics. And you'd see a change in him in terms of like his affect. And at times I would think he's being theatrical right now. I don't know if this is real, but people responded to it. And once he had them there, then he would start introducing topics or ideas like pluralism, tolerance in the form of storytelling. And so he'd talk about things like husbands and wives fighting, why it's important that there's tolerance in the home and how it affects the family. And he'd, sprinkle in jokes and things about himself, and people love that. And so again, on paper, most of these communities would never support some of the things he was saying. You need to have pluralism in this community that, A, B, and C, but they loved him. And it was like, how is he doing that? So I started to see that model happen again with him. And what was interesting is I started participating with him as well, not intended, because I just wanted to observe. But what was interesting is what happens when you have someone that's very different than you in your community, that's kind of paired with you and seen with you. I think, even though it seems a little counterintuitive, I think it makes people from that community, like an influencer, appear more authentic, to have more depth because of the people they're interacting with. And so 20 years later, I ended up writing a book that's coming out in a few months with a publisher out of Singapore, that focuses on terrorism and insurgency narratives, but it's based off of that ethnographic research I did. I just applied models of communication deception as an analytical framework to pull out those threads where it's like, this is, as a case study, maybe it's just a case study, but it's interesting when you look at it from this perspective. And again, this is something that continues to be relevant for me, when you're talking about how do you communicate certain things to the public and to people you definitely want to reach, like unknown offenders, right?
Mhm.
How do you communicate it in a way so you might actually influence them to engage in certain behaviors? Because all of this has nothing to do with thinking and feeling something. It's got to go beyond that. It's got to have a behavioral objective. That was something that was really emphasized when I was a profiler at the behavioral analysis unit, which is we're not wasting time on just people thinking and feeling they have to do something. What is it that you want them to do? And so that stuff continues to intersect, and it's been those kind of unusual experiences like that that have continued to, I guess, contribute to some of my perspective on this, and kind of taking more of a maybe a nonlinear approach. Um, I think also those kind of experiences in life really um, they keep I guess they really kinda push you to a place where you're willing to put yourself in another position, and I'm sure this resonates with you as well. It's that kind of engagement with people who are, suffering from the loss of a family member, people who are angry at the loss of a family member, that a crime's been committed against them, all the range of emotions that people are going through, you got to be able to engage with them, think clearly through these things, and do your analysis. And in many of these cases, when I was with the BAU, a lot of times when I was filming with families, oftentimes they were persons of interest. So it's like, yes, there is information suggesting they might be responsible for this, but I kind of have to put that aside and focus on this engagement, and that there's purpose behind it, right? Like, yes, we want to get out information to the public about things they should know about this case, but we also want to continue to engage with this person of interest because we're trying to get somewhere in the case, right? And we're trying to wield influence here in terms of getting to some kind of goal in the case. So there's always I've tried to pair behavioral objectives to whatever those other objectives are. At the FBI, they would be investigative objectives. Trying to do that now with, say, a victim's family, where it's like, well, I may not be working with a law enforcement agency, so I don't have investigative goals I'm pointing to, but the family still has goals. They have goals. And so how can I create content that's going to help them achieve those behavioral goals, whatever they might be? So I mean, that's where it keeps kind of intersecting back to how to kind of bring this all together.
It sounds like an incredible journey and a very indirect path to where you got to today, but
Yeah,
in
that's true.
doing that, you get, like you said, all those different experiences. You whether it's academic or personal or professional on that journey, right? And
Yeah.
it shapes who you are today. You know, I can definitely relate to that. You know, my first academics, I did political science and international relations. Then I went down to the States into DC and I did defense and strategic studies. That was my master's.
Mm,
And then from there, a master's certificate in modern counterterrorism strategies. And I did all this before I got into
mm,
geographic profiling and criminology. And it just makes me better at what I do now.
mm.
And
Yeah.
I can see that in you because it seems like the whole psychology and behavioral component
Mhm.
you got along the way through all these different experiences.
Yeah, it's like we just don't really have the labels for them yet,
Mhm.
but we're experiencing it. Yeah, exactly, yeah.
It's amazing. I love it. And how many languages do you speak today?
You know, to be completely honest, it's really just English, and again, really poor Indonesian. When I came back from Indonesia, I continued studying Indonesian, and that actually helped get me into the FBI because back then, Indonesian was a critical language
Mhm.
because of terrorism concerns. So that's how I was able to score well enough to waive the 3 years work experience required at the time. I had none because they didn't count internships essentially when I applied. But that got my foot in the door. Of course, I never had anything to do with Indonesia and the FBI. I never used the language at all
Mm.
when I was there. But that kind of intensive, immersive experience, you can't shake off that stuff. So it's like I've gone through periods in the years since where I listen to Indonesian or I read articles, and listening to Indonesian, I'm like, I cannot keep up. I have no idea. So I'd say I'd be in trouble still if someone dropped me in Indonesia tomorrow
Mhm.
and said good luck. I'd have some trouble for sure. So yeah.
Yeah, I'm the same way. I took Russian as a minor in
Mhm.
university, but I haven't spoken Russian in 15 years.
Yeah.
So, and Canadian, I have some French as well, but, English, and then I have a little bits of these other 2 languages. But, uh, the the writing on terrorism that you're authoring,
Yeah.
is that with Dr. Rohan Gunaratne?
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, I read his book, Inside Al Qaeda
Okay.
in my master's.
Yeah,
So,
he's
I'm
he's
very
been
familiar
like
with
a
who he
pillar
is, yeah.
for a while, right? In
Mhm.
Southeast Asia. Yeah.
Yeah, he's been around for a long time, and his, uh, his his books are fantastic. So, before the FBI, you were you had a fellowship with the CIA and then went from there to the DIA?
Yeah, I mean, it was essentially an internship for grad students. That's
Oh,
just what they called it.
mhm,
But I was there the summer before I went to Indonesia and the summer after. And after that, then was at DIA for a year as an analyst, focusing on Southeast Asia while I was processing for the FBI. I just never expected to work for the FBI because I thought they just did bank robberies and things like that. And but I was trying some different places, and the more I got into the process, the more I learned about it, the more I thought, hey, this could be a good fit. And ultimately, that was the best fit for me. Um, just to have that mix of, as an agent, the freedom and responsibility running a case on important things. Like, that's something I really enjoyed, and I enjoyed the human aspect of it too. In terms of interacting with people, whether it was interviews or human recruitment or anything like that. That's the part of casework that I really loved. But much of that time in the FBI, I was doing counterintelligence, and then kind of started the shift towards cyber, um, and did some time at headquarters, then back to the field. And it was around that time that I met some profilers from the behavioral analysis unit for the first time, and they specialized in cyber and like profiling hackers. And it was I'm sure of course I must have been aware of the BAU from like movies or stuff like that, but it wasn't something I thought about. I didn't have intentions for that place in my career because I thought I'm going to do other things. But as I got to see what they could do on cases, I was like, okay, yeah. And I started going to them for a lot of cases, for my cases, and they really fed some of my own outrageous ideas I had about like how we could approach cases a little bit differently. That's how I got to know some of these profilers. And after some time at headquarters, I went back to the field office and stayed in touch with them. And an opening came up, and I did not expect to get in. I guess so early. I mean, most profilers on average don't go to the BAU until they have about 10 years of experience in the field, which I was close to at that time. I just thought, "Oh, it's too soon," because it's really a departure from casework. You're assisting other people on their cases, but you're not running cases anymore once you're at the BAU. They'll tell you on day one, like, don't focus on the investigative step, focus on the behavior. That's what you're here for. So the pace changes dramatically. For the most part, you're not interviewing people, you're not getting people's trash, you're not doing surveillance, you're not doing any of that. You're not juggling all these cases. You might just be focusing on one for a while, or maybe multiple, and that can range from everywhere from like 2 weeks to 2 days to 2 months. But yeah, that was a quick shift. And the FBI, from my own experience, has always been a place that you can definitely remake yourself many times. And I kind of did that because at some point I shifted to cyber and cyber terrorism, and that was a new thing for me. And then of course the shift to the BAU, and that was a new thing for me as well, being trained in that way and gaining that experience. And so you can do that in the FBI. It's a big enough place, and there's a lot of opportunities to do that. But that's how I ended up getting there. So I got to the behavioral analysis unit in May of 2018, and then I was there for about 6 years, almost 6 years, before I transitioned the private sector.
With the BAU and
Yeah.
with your path into cyber. Well, first of all, what's the difference between BAU and BAU2?
Uh, they're the same thing essentially. I can tell you about the structure of it. So the behavioral analysis unit has 4 operational units, and then the 5th unit is focused on research only. And so the 4 operational units are staffed with agents, and some of those units have embedded psychologists, but for the most part, it's contract psychiatrists and psychologists, um, and other professors out there or scholars that they work with infrequently or intermittently. And so you have the numbers change at times over the years, but when I was there, BAU2 was the unit that focused on cyber and counterintelligence. Um, but it started with the original unit, crimes against adults, and that's where you find the legend and lore of the BAU. They're still doing that stuff. And then another unit focuses just on crimes against children, and then another unit, well, of course, was our cyber and counterintelligence, and then the fourth one was really focused on threat assessment. So it'd be everything from school shooters, bomb threats, terrorism, domestic and international. Everyone's trained and certified in the same way, but everyone has different backgrounds. And definitely the units that had the crimes against children and the unit I was on were more likely to have concentrated expertise in those areas, because I mean, really, in the FBI doesn't necessarily investigate murder. They work with detectives and state and local law enforcement partners. So that's what their experience is mostly going to be. But you're going to find a lot of agents on crimes against adults. That unit, they're probably worked other things too in their career, like white collar crime or public corruption or something like that, because you just don't have squads that are focused on murder because they're looking at federal crimes. So it would run the gamut. But I mean, like the crimes against children unit, those would almost always be agents their whole career. They've worked that kind of case, which is important for them, to obviously build up coping skills for working with that kind of material. But yeah, you have these 4 units, um, and that's how they would separate the kind of things you work on. The training and certification process has changed at times over the years, but for the most part, it's on the job right away. And they start phase one. They have 2 phases. Phase one will start in the spring every year. So you could come right after it starts and you've got to wait a whole year, or you could come right before and maybe you're in luck. I came after it started, but I actually think that was beneficial for me because by the time I started phase one, I already had some experience under my belt. And by on the job training, I mean, you're really just observing. And you're with more experienced profilers and watching how they do things. But phase one is about 4 to 5 months, and it's every day, it's classroom instruction. And this is where the BAU spends most of their money, is bringing in scholars to do training. Obviously, so you got into COVID, a lot of stuff is going virtual. I when I was there for a couple of years, I was on the curriculum committee as they were getting accreditation for this training, because for decades it's just been FBI training, not necessarily a third party accrediting it. But so every unit tries to diversify the curriculum. You have standard curriculum that everyone's got to have, but every unit can contribute their own things to it as well, bring in their own people. And so there'd be years where we would have a heavy dose of digital forensics, and people who weren't going to be on those units didn't really like that because it's just they're not going to use it. But the whole purpose is, well, we need to expose you to it. But yeah, after 4 to 5 months, you finish phase one, and phase two is you do rotations on each unit. And those rotations are supposed to be 30 days, but most of them are longer. And it's up to you if you want to make it longer. I kind of dragged it out a little bit because I just felt like there was no rush and I wanted to spend my time. And it depends on the personalities on that unit. If you're supposed to lead cases, but most people aren't comfortable with that. I mean, as they maybe they shouldn't be comfortable with that because I wouldn't want to be a lead profiler on a crimes against the children case. I don't have that kind of expertise. But again, you're still applying the same kind of behavioral analysis frameworks to it. Um, and once you finish phase two, there's a period of observation that's about a year. And then after that, you can be officially certified. So that can take close to 3 years. But the truth is, really being a practicing profiler, I mean, by the time you're into phase two, people are starting to see you as, oh, yes, you're a junior profiler, but you should be handling your own cases. You already have your own cases assigned to you. It'll just take you longer. That was always an overwhelming thing for me, how some people move through cases so quickly because I felt overwhelmed by the amount of material I thought I would have to go through. But you get to a point where you can do things very quickly. And even though you're always trying to be mindful of what can I really say based on the information I have, really trying to nuance it and not be definitive, but at least point out some things. You get to a point where you become experienced and you feel comfortable. If someone calls you, an agent calls you, and like, can you take a look at this material I'm going to send you? And you can take 5 minutes, look at it, and then go. I'll have that discussion. There's a lot you can say, not just because of what you've learned and experienced, but really pulling in a lot of the research that's out there that might suggest A, B, or C things to think about. A lot of times investigators are also just looking for that, like, what am I not considering? Is there another way to look at this? So that whole process, though, of behavioral analysis, there are definitely some similarities in terms of how people approach it each time, and every unit kind of does it differently, like the kind of frameworks they depend on. But generally speaking, some of those principles in victimology and criminology apply, where it's like we want a baseline of behavior, we want information in the aggregate, we want to look back at choices they've made at different points in their life that might tell us something about not just who they are, but who they were then, and like what were really the influences on their decision making. Of course, there are cases all the time where we didn't have that at all, or as an unknown offender, we just work with what we have. And that's when you lean a little bit more heavily on the research literature in particular kind of areas. But the whole point is behavioral analysis gave you some kind of baseline. It revealed some kind of vulnerabilities, maybe in an offender, that might inform investigative strategy. And what they were hoping for then would be recommendations. So really, as a profiler at the behavioral analysis unit, you really are like a consultant. That's how you should be seen. That's how you should carry yourself. And we would often say that as an example, because we also didn't want anyone to think we're being territorial. We're still a headquarters division, an operational division. We're still the suits at headquarters. And people were very wary of like us trying to come in, or that's kind of like more of a folkloric thing. The FBI comes in and takes cases or whatever. It'd be the same thing though with detectives at state and local law enforcement partners, where they might have ideas about who you are because you work with the FBI, and maybe also if you're a profiler, and you can use that to your advantage, not in a malicious way, but more like if you're trying to be influential and really provide behaviorally based recommendations. If those recommendations conflict with a viewpoint of a law enforcement agency, that can be difficult. But the whole point is, what's very different about, I think, that approach anyway, is the rigor that's assigned to it. A lot of times I think it with intelligence analysis, or just investigators and agents having a gut feeling about something, or they're pulling on their experience, they may not be wrong about that. But if you don't also have some kind of analytical framework or theory even that you can point to indirectly apply it, to analyze it with that, if you're not pulling in data for the basis for your reasoning or your analysis, that's not very strong. So yeah, I thought before I came to the BAU that I was a pretty good interviewer. And maybe I was, but I look back and like, man, I made all kinds of mistakes. I thought this interview was effective, but it wasn't. All I was doing was browbeating this person basically, the way I was speaking, those kind of things. And so our approach is always, well, we know what you've been trained in. Consider this approach. Consider this interviewing technique, which is a little bit different, but here's why. Because this is what we've seen from this person's behavior. We think they're most likely to respond to you if you take this kind of approach. So that was always the case, and it was why I was there, because I was, an amateur videographer. That's when I had the opportunity to get into making cold case content with the other units, crimes against children and crimes against adults. That's how that kind of transpired. It was a little bit of personal passion and a little bit proposing the ideas with some of those profilers and them becoming champions for it. That's kind of how that started. Yeah.
The last 5-10 minutes there kind of was more informative as to how the BAU is set up than I've read in any book. So I find it very interesting. And before we get into what you're doing today, and then into Rachel's case and the behavioral content creation, what exactly is? Well, I'll give you my background in cyber.
Okay.
So when I was doing my master's in DC, I interned at the Heritage Foundation. I interned there for 2 semesters in defense and foreign policy. And the 2 areas that they had me focused on were missile defense at the time, because they were putting up missile defense infrastructure in Poland and Czech Republic at that time, and cyber. So a lot of the blogging at that time on cyber, that was me blogging that out. And I'm not a tech person. I was, strategy, geopolitics, cyber deterrence, that kind of thing. And, at one point, and I find that, which is why I was really excited to have you on today, for the cold case work you're doing, but also for that background that you have, because it was a passion of mine at one point too. So what is cyber profiling, and when it comes to the BAU, how is cyber profiling becoming more and more prevalent and more important these days as we're more integrated?
I think it is. I think it is very slowly though, because if you go to a lot of vendor firms like Google, Mandiant, CrowdStrike, they don't necessarily have dedicated positions like that. You see reflections of it in everyone's work, right? Like they're looking at the behaviors of a threat actor. They're looking at the behaviors that they observe in malware when they deconstruct it. But in terms of like a very concentrated discipline of behavioral analysis in a cyber realm, it's not really out there yet. 10 years from now, I think it will be. I think it will be. There's a lot of manifestations of this, some of them more like fads, but like people talk about cyber psychology, and I'm less familiar with that. I think people are trying to make that a discipline and saying, well, it's just psychology and all things cyber. I don't know if that applies that explicitly, because you still have these like you still have grounded theory in different places, in terms of like people's behaviors, and you can't just throw those labels on it. So in terms of like what is cyber profiling, it really is just profiling in an online space, but there's other considerations. There's many parallels. So if you look at something like tool selection, you can make some presuppositions with an offender and on an offender based on the weapon they choose. It could be wrong, but you could say like, well, there's definitely a difference between someone who chooses poison to kill their victims and someone who chooses poison but they actually want to be there when the person's dying. Or There's purposeful choice that says something about maybe that relationship for an offender to bludgeon someone's face, right? Usually people will say they knew them or it was a romantic relationship.
Mm.
That's not always right, but a lot of times it is. And so the same thing happens with cyber behavioral analysis, if you want to call it that, because when we look at tool and technique selection, it's very similar. Using a particular suite of tools suggests, at least, this is what they're most comfortable with. This is what they have access to. This might be their level of sophistication. Um, that's changing rapidly, though. It's becoming a little confusing when AI enters the picture, and because so many of these tool sets and software are so comprehensive, you can do so many different techniques with one tool that can be confusing. But we know that like there are threat actor groups that they prefer particular kind of tools. And so do we keep that in mind when we're weighing like is there deception here? Are they trying to masquerade like they're another country? Yeah, of course. But seeing someone like 5 years ago using a suite of tools in like Kali Linux, nowadays you're gonna have very good threat actors, talented threat actors that want to use that, but they repurpose it in different ways and they use it very well, and they probably want to appear a certain way. 5 years ago, I would have said they're using Kali Linux because a little bit's like plug and play. They may not be as technically capable as people think. They may not be that creative with their approach. We would take victimology much in the same way you look at any offender outside of cyber, and we're thinking about like still vulnerability, availability, desirability. Same thing with targets in a cyber realm. If they deface some website in a small town with the ISIS flag, that's still going to scare people. But we would look at that and be like, these guys aren't any good. They probably scanned for vulnerabilities and this came up. Truly, I'm sure they desired to deface the Pentagon's website with ISIS flag. That's what they would have wanted to do. They probably can't do it. They're probably not good enough to do it. So they're going to pick something that's vulnerable and available. And so even if we don't know who they are, we still can step back and say, based on what we have here, based on what we see, it might suggest that this threat actor is not as threatening as people might think. And you're taking that emotion and fear out of it and looking at what are they actually demonstrating. There's definitely a component to forensics too that we would break up like a crime scene. So at the BAU, we call it digital criminalistics, but we kind of still square it up. Like, do we see ritual? Do we see staging? Do we see any examples of MO? That's important. Most threat actors are just as purposeful as offenders offline in choosing their display of their tools and their executables and any of those things. So if we see something like a naming convention on a piece of malware executable file, that might be a very purposeful name for that file that might reveal something about this third actor. And even if we don't know what that is, we're still piecing together those behavioral artifacts because down the road there might be some attribution made from that. Um, and it all kind of feeds into that portrait of that person, a personality assessment or a self-concept analysis. It's tied in with the technical analysis we're trying to do as well of their capabilities. So that's why I'd say the domain's different, but it's basically it's pretty much the same. That's why I say like you can be trained and certified like any other profiler, and you the expectation is even if you don't have a background in cyber, you can hang with the case a little bit. You may not be able to do more profound things, but you can understand enough to know like this might be what we're seeing here. But the application of it as an example where you try to bring everything together. I had a call once from an agent who had contact with a ransomware actor online, and this it wasn't overt. It was they were using like a pseudo, like a sock puppet, but they wanted to get some ideas for how maybe different ways they could approach this ransomware actor. And I remember the first thing I did because there wasn't a lot of information on this person was look at their social media accounts for that ransomware group And there are a bunch of artifacts that popped out to me. One that they had already rebranded once in a year and a half. And also, I was looking at people's comments where they were saying, "I don't even know if these guys are good enough to break into anything. I think they're just reselling data that has already been stolen." We so those are just artifacts out there, but in certain framing, to me, it suggested there might be some reputational insecurity there. That might be a really sore point for them if they felt the need to rebrand in less than 2 years. And it's very likely they're reactive to people's commentary suggesting they're no good. And that might play into the interactions I was starting to see between the agent and this ransomware actor. Like, what are they reactive to? What makes them angry? So we kind of have that knowledge and we communicate that to them without knowing a whole lot about them. But there's framing we can point to in theory and research literature that suggests that people are sensitive about this issue. Anything that you bring to that engagement that suggests that they can't do this or that, they're probably going to be reactive to it. And maybe you want them to be. Maybe you want them to start to have an overload cognitively and emotionally because they're angry. So they're not paying attention enough with things you're sending to them or other kind of technical things happening on the side. All that stuff kind of comes together, but it's still just root behavioral analysis that's applied to the cyber realm. I think the difference too is gaining experience and familiarity with things that are common or not common, right? In those spaces, in terms of especially nowadays, tools they're using and what they're doing when maybe they get onto a server. I mean, I can look at something like someone gets into a server, they were there for about 2 hours. We have no idea who they are. We don't know if they took anything, but within the first minute, they did a query on that server for Bitcoin. That's very different than if 5 minutes before they left the server, they did a query for Bitcoin. If they did it right before they left the server, it might suggest to me that they were staging to say, like, oh, look, I'm just a cyber criminal looking for Bitcoin. But the fact that they did it right away suggests to me, no, they may actually be that. That this wasn't something that they're trying to stage, but that's what it. So we take those things with a heavy dose of caution and like, well, it's not definitive, but this is what we're starting to see. But that's all about having a conversation. I think I don't know if it's been your experience in geographic profiling with this, but I the whole methodology is meant to be a discussion with people and exploring possibilities with a little more framing and rigor, and also suggesting some possibilities, even if it's not definitive. That's very different than people are like, I just have a feeling. This is what I think it is. This is why I think it is. Which I'm sure same experience for you is very frustrating when people have other things that are kind of leading them. It's like, what's that based off of? But that's really what it is. Not obviously people sitting in a dark room, daydreaming and guessing who the offender is. No, of course, there's methodology and rigor to it. So,
I would like that to be a larger part of what I do, that experience, the discussions with other geographic profilers. The difficulty is there's not many geographic profilers out there. However, most people that are trained in geographic profiling, most crime analysts, they're trained at the GPA 1 level. It's nonviolent crime, but I only focus on violent crime and missing persons. And hopefully, and I'm trying to get more into fugitive apprehension as well. So there's very few people for me to have those discussions with. I try to have discussions with people such as yourself, profilers, ex-profilers, and kind of bounce ideas off them, as well as people involved in search and rescue. They all have a bit of geographic profiling in them.
sure.
They've learned that along the way. Like, I'm sure you know quite a bit about geographic profiling yourself. The cyber profiling is, I find it fascinating. It's something I've never really gotten into, and it's actually encroaching on geographic profiling a bit, the online world.
Mm,
One case that I commented on a few years back, and there's actually been another very similar one since here in Canada, bomb threats,
mm,
especially against, say, for example, schools. There was one
yeah.
here in Ontario where I live a few years back, and there was a bomb threat against a school. and then there were multiple bomb threats against other schools in the same area, then in another city. And I was just like, hold on a sec. This isn't coming from here. This is coming from somewhere else. Anyway, ultimately what it ended up being is a 16-year-old in the UK online was chatting with high school students in Canada and getting them to call in the bomb threats.
Interesting.
So when it's encroaching on geographic profiling like that, it completely obscures your picture.
Yeah, and just an idea, I guess we could call it that idea, that pause of kind of holding conclusions until you find out a little bit more. I think definitely in the past year, that's been an experience of mine in like other podcasts and other discussions where it's like, I think people are too quick to make a conclusion about what it is. And the example in that case, like you mentioned, like it'd be very easy to be wrong about that. People are going to presume it's someone local, of course. So that's hard to cut through that and have people like hold up. And I think, thankfully this wasn't too much of my experience, and it might be because a lot of the agents in leadership that I provided recommendations to weren't always necessarily that cyber savvy. So I think maybe they're a little more dependent on what I had to say, but trying to also communicate a lot of unknowns is difficult. To be like, well, we don't know, or we don't know this, or can you find out more about this, or this might be the wrong, because people just want to move quickly and catch those people. Definitely was a bit of a frustration at first with for me when I started helping the Morin family in the case, because I was very focused on audience, right? Who is the audience? And so, a discussion I had with Matt at one point is, look, if you're people who are saying this guy's a monster and this and that, who are you actually trying to reach with any of this content? It's actually probably not going to be the public so much. It's probably going to be this guy and his family and friends. And if they know anything about this, they probably don't, but they're not going to be thinking of him because they probably don't think of him as a monster in all these other ways. It's just not the right approach. But that's obviously very difficult to make that impression with a family member who's lost someone, and you're trying to say, don't call that killer a bad guy. But it makes a difference, and a heavy dose of my experience when I did assist with state and local law enforcement on cold cases. And usually I wasn't front and center. If I was making content, it'd be other profilers who worked crimes against children or adults. But a big part of that was consulting with leadership at state and local agencies about things they might want to consider saying or not saying publicly. And definitely people running FBI offices, a big part of that was coaching. It's a huge part of it for all the units, is essentially coaching for leadership that are making public statements, because it's so key. I mean, a major case study that they teach on in phase 1 was about a missing girl in elementary school in Denver. And the issue was that this girl, I think it was a single mom, and this mom would work nights and her daughter would be at home sleeping. And so when she came home from work, her daughter was getting ready for school, and then her daughter would walk to school, and she'd meet a friend halfway there, and they continue walking to school. I can't remember the name of this girl, but it was a national case. And she went missing one day, and the school kept calling this mom, but she was missing all the calls and the voicemails because she was asleep. And so it was probably like 2 p.m. before she woke up and got all these messages from the school and started freaking out, obviously wondering where her daughter was, because they're like, your daughter didn't come to school today. She's reported absent. And it was probably close to like 5 p.m. before she finally called the police, because she was trying to make sense of things, call the friend's house, try and find out, drive around herself to look for her daughter. And it was imperative that the public not find out for a while that that's what happened with the mom's schedule, because they were convinced if the public hears that, they're going to stop looking for this girl, because people are going to probably presume the mom had something to do with it. She slept through. She didn't even know her daughter was missing. And so those are behaviors that we want to try and manage, not to deceive the public, but because time is imperative in terms of getting people to pay attention. So those were lessons that had nothing to do with cyber necessarily, but we would all learn those definitely as lessons learned of like keep in mind like how important this stuff is and what happened in these cases. And I was fortunate that while I was there, as I started getting into content creation, I had a lot more opportunity to help with these cold cases because, most of my career I'd never been around any homicides or any missing persons because I did cyber and other national security stuff.
So moving on into the behavioral content creation, what's the you've touched on it a bit here, but what's the
Mhm.
idea behind it, and how do you go about creating each individual video?
I guess the central idea of behavioral content creation is that there's truly behavioral design behind it. And I break it down to two models. One I call the consumer approach, and the other I call the concentrated approach. The concentrated approach is really meant to be an investigative technique. So the idea that there is engagement with people of interest in a case, that there is engagement with witnesses or potential witnesses, that you're creating content that the public is seeing, and more than likely the offender is seeing as well. You have a very concentrated opportunity to really influence behaviors in that case. And as an investigative technique, it can really run the gamut how it's applied. It's been everything from filming family members who were also suspects, and then bringing that raw, unedited video back to the field office and playing it in a room of like 40 agents and detectives, and then talking about it afterwards. And it's phenomenal how all these different people notice different things. And think about that in contrast to how things usually go, which would be two investigators go interview them, and they come back, they share some highlights, they have their notes, they write it up in the official case file, and only some people see it. So now you've opened up an aspect of that case to many people that ordinarily would never be able to get in front of these people of interest. So those are examples how it can be investigative technique. Also, the themes that come up in this filming, I'll talk to them for 45 minutes to an hour, film them, and edit something that ends up being like 2 minutes or less. But it's surprising what people say in front of a camera. They forget there's a camera. They're also not in an interview room, and I don't think they feel threatened. And so the point is, they're doing something that is very open ended. It's very much like motivational interviewing, where you're guiding them through it. And it creates a lot of opportunities to explore different areas. And those themes that emerge are important for investigators too. It gives them talking points, or even talking points to return to. Sometimes I would do this with detectives, sometimes not. It also can be an investigative technique to create a series of videos and content, again, that maybe is meant to give a certain impression. There is a case a couple years back that we didn't end up doing this, but we made it to do this. But the idea would have been, if you have a number of people who are witnesses in a homicide, a cold case homicide, who are willing to go on camera and then have that video made public, and they're sharing details about that case that have not been public before, but also being careful that they don't say anything that could expose them to legal action, or that they're slandering anyone or anything like that, and also not putting them in any kind of danger, right? Like they're making allegations or something that might communicate something very striking to an offender. The idea behind doing something like that is to give the impression to the offender that a lot of people are starting to come forward, more than even the ones you see on camera. Because if they're doing this on the camera, imagine who else is coming forward. That there is a movement, that there are forces moving against that offender. Those might be real or they might be imagined. But the whole idea is to influence that offender, that they might need to alter their decision making. And that could be key if you have a detective now that is trying to talk to that suspected offender, and things have changed now in their whole calculation of the loss they're potentially facing. They might decide, I need to take my chances and try and talk to this investigator. Some of that might be theoretical, but those are examples of how it can be an investigative technique in a criminal space with like cold cases. In Also, I think for the consumer approach, that second part of it, which is what the Rachel Morin case is, would be we don't necessarily know who the offender is. Um, I'm not doing that with the law enforcement agency where we're trying to align investigative goals with behavioral. It's much more cast towards the public and the unknown offender and unknown friends of the offender. And it's meant to also both of them be highly affective content because people are really only going to share emotional content. And I also want to present people in that content as vulnerable in a lot of cases because usually I want them to be likable, right? I want people to see them as having depth and being authentic because if we're trying to influence behaviors like people coming forward, people calling in tips, maybe influencing people's impressions of the law enforcement agency working on that case, all those things are can be really important. The first one I ever did years and years ago was on a cold case homicide of a boy who was killed in 2000, and this is like rural Tennessee. And the whole approach was to get the sheriff in that case not to have a press conference, but just wait, let us do a video series first. And the whole idea really is a consumer approach is we wanted to prepare those neighborhoods before investigators came in the canvas about this case because 20 years had passed. So some people they were new to it, some people remembered it, some people forgot about it. So it was a way to raise awareness again and prepare them that investigators are coming to talk to people about this. And that was really impactful. And in that case in particular, we didn't even pay for advertising. They just put it on their Facebook page. And in 1 week's time, they had 8,000 engagements, as in like likes and comments, and 40,000 views just on Facebook. And the investigators told me literally every house they went to, people had mentioned the videos. So that has more of a consumer approach for behavioral content creation. The goals being raise awareness, educate people, but there's investigative technique to that case too, whereas the making of the videos and the fact that the newly identified offender in that case saw those videos and maybe he or she thinks there's movement now and people are going to start sharing information that they wouldn't before. All those kind of pressures, which I know are hard to measure, can be really key when you're trying to manage a real-time environment with known or unknown offenders. That's why things you don't want to leave it static, but in general, the consumer approach of just casting it out a little wide is just not going to be as effective because there's really no behavioral goals you can attach it to. What you can see effectiveness in is, do people consume this media a lot? Do they want to share it? Do they respond to it? And there's just too many ways that we can't really measure its impact, right? As a final example, in some of these cases, for behavioral content creation, I've made it for cold cases to repair the reputation of a family. And because of one of the problems in one of these cases was people were kind of divided in a town about this family. And nationally, too, the case had national attention. It was kind of 50-50 on this family did it, they were responsible. That was causing issues for the investigators. And the whole idea was even if I don't know who was actually responsible, I want to do a video series to make them appear more authentic. Because if it's possible that they had nothing to do with this, then we need to encourage people to come forward and we need the family to look likable. So this is I mean in marketing it's not a novel technique, but in law enforcement it is, and it's different. It's a different approach. And we could measure some of the effectiveness of that. In that case in particular, it was actually the Carly Goose case out in California. And one of the goals in that case was, can we draw people to the FBI landing page with information there? And it was a very saturated environment because it was a national case, saturated online. There was a private Facebook page for Carly Goose that had like 19,000 people. And we're like, how are we going to get people to the landing pages if everyone's talking about this and you have like influencers putting on their makeup with like 3 million views talking about the case, which that is always going to be, would always beat us in the metrics. After we did that video series, though, it did get a lot of traction. Those videos are still on the FBI's YouTube page. I mean, some of them did very well in terms of like 1,000 likes and 60 to 70,000 views. What was important though is for a number of years, when you typed in 3 names of that family, the top search return on Google was always the FBI landing pages. So there could be other factors in that, of course, but to us, that was a consumer approach to behavioral content creation where we had a goal of, can we get the public's attention over here? There's a mix, but that's generally what it is. It's behaviorally based because we're crafting that content with those behavioral considerations in mind. Like, who are we trying to reach? Can we create content that shows vulnerability and induces affect? And do we have a particular target in mind? And what you're trying to do is pair that up with the ways you people would make content that people really enjoy sharing, which is you add music to it, you edit it in a way that, like, people can process it better. There's one person in that short film that's 90 seconds instead of what you usually see in law enforcement, which is a 10-minute video with a deputy sheriff in a suit in a boardroom telling you about the case. And there's a lot of stock footage of like crime scene tape. And that's just how a lot of agencies do videos. And they don't really get traction. This is more about aligning it with the trends we see in marketing, where this is how people share content. This is what they like, and this is a different way. So instead of us being a public relations type of firm that's just trying to raise awareness, we actually have goals in mind of trying to reach certain people, certain audiences, and we want them to do something. That's really the core of behavioral content creation.
The first time I met you on Surviving the Survivor podcast, I was fascinated by it, and I've been wanting to peel back the layers ever since because I didn't quite understand the
Yeah.
scope of it, but it seems like there's so many applications for it. When you talk about the consumer application is and inducing affect, is the offender's family and those close to the offender, are you looking at getting this to them and targeting them as well?
Yeah. I mean, it depends on the case, but generally, yes. What would make that the concentrated aspect of behavioral content creation is if we knew who they were. So
Right.
I really break it down this way. You have consumer and you have concentrated. In consumer, the main variables of that are vulnerability and affect. And you have vulnerability and affect and concentrated, but the third piece is relationships, right? So you're still creating content that makes people look dimensional and have depth, but in concentrated, we probably know who they are and we know something about their relationships, and that's what we're trying to influence. So in the Morin case, we did not know who their family members were. And that's why I was on that realm of consumer approach, because I want them to see it. I want them to see the Morin family and Matt's family as I wanted to create content that maybe they could connect with. I wanted the offender to see them and maybe see them a little bit differently than the way things are talked about or portrayed in the news. I was trying to create content where it wasn't the Morin family just walking around calling him a monster and a killer, but showing another side to this family and the loss that they've endured. Um, but in a concentrated approach, if I knew who the family members were, I would create content just for them, even if it was out there publicly, because it might be something about that family or the alleged killer or whatever that I can craft into it that might make them responsive to it. It just depends what it is. You'd have to be case specific, but that's really where I kind of draw the line. The more, if I have a target that I can actually identify, now I have something to work with, because this is where you start doing that behavioral analysis and you know something about them and you're trying to identify vulnerabilities or what are they most likely to be actually responsive to. It's really no different than doing an interview strategy, like the things you know about them, the topics that you think they're going to react to in a certain way. You're giving them an opportunity to tell their life story, but that's still, you're still preparing for that interview based on what you do know about them. And so without that information, the consumer approach has to be the way to go to portray and display the Morin family in a particular kind of way so that perhaps it'll drive behaviors where people will share information or people will call in a tip, or there could be a number of things, or nothing could happen. Because it's like, if they don't see it, does that mean persuasion or influence doesn't work? Not necessarily. We just may never know about it. But it is definitely much more blinded doing the consumer approach, because in many ways you're just putting content out there, but you're making content that people typically like to share or they will share. And so that can improve your chances of visibility and people actually engaging with it. But nothing beats a situation where you know who you're really trying to reach and what you want them to do. Then you can craft something that's very rich and probably effective.
Are you able to focus the content with knowing pieces of who the offender is rather than their actual identity? For example, with Victor um, Hernandez, are you able to, we knew that he committed a crime in Los Angeles, so he's has some relationship to the LA area.
Sure.
We knew that he was Hispanic. So with these little pieces of information, are you able to start um, creating this content in a specific way based on having pieces of the puzzle rather than the whole thing?
Definitely. I mean, this is where you see a reflection of that behavioral analysis process. If I was working with investigators, what I would have done is I would have only made content that was in Spanish, and I would have been broadcasting that into Spanish speaking communities. I would have focused mainly on that. I think that would have been more effective. But with the family, that wasn't really an option, right? And no one could know for sure what his story was. I mean, we find out after he was arrested that I guess he also was responsible for a murder in El Salvador. Knowing that he was escaping a murder already really changes this guy's story and trajectory, right? Like, because of whatever happened in LA, there's a lot of ways you can look at this. And this is always a point of contention for me, where it's like, um, what if LA was some of his first steps in habituation of high risk criminal activity and behaviors like that? The fact that he was risky enough to walk into a house and do that, whatever he may have been doing in Bel Air, is that offender who's learned from that and now he's taking a different approach? Or is this still a very young and inexperienced offender who is just choosing a less risky option, which might be watching people from afar in the woods, right? And still someone that's driven by sexual arousal, probably. So those are things that we don't know about him, but we can presume maybe. There have been cases where I've made content before where I know a little bit about how this offender um, communicated with a family member of a victim. I knew a little bit about, even though we didn't know who he was at the time, the things that he hated and the things that excited him. And then we pull in other pieces to it, where if this person's a serial offender and you look at more of the historical literature on, say, serial killers who tended to become aroused when they see people in pain and crying and suffering, then maybe we want to make content like that because he's going to enjoy seeing that. And so we may not know that about him or know who he is, but those are enough pieces that we can start to craft something and see, and we might see a response to it. Maybe a better example is, with it still has the same application, ransomware negotiations, where it's like this threat actor or the person negotiating for a ransomware group is probably an unknown person, and it might even just be customer service, but you can still have very fruitful communications with an unknown offender because you're structuring your communications to yield more behavior. So, especially in a situation where you're assisting an investigation, there's also great purpose to creating content that is just meant to induce another step in the investigation and see how the offender responds to it. Even if the public might just see that content as, oh, they're putting out more content about this case, for an investigation, it might be, and it has been in past examples, we're trying to move it along and we want to use that video as another behavioral artifact to see how the suspected offender responds to it, then go talk to him. I've been in situations where we've tried something where for an interview, we had detectives show them video content first that I had created to try and induce emotions from them, then go into the interview. And the idea, the theory was if they're in some state of cognitive overload emotionally, it might be harder for them to be deceptive. And we might actually get to see a contrast in their baseline, their emotional baseline, and how they talk about things when they're at different states of affect or emotions they can name. And that was a proof of concept thing, and it was hit or miss, but also had some interesting responses from people because it changes the whole nature of that engagement with an investigator when you've induced affect already in somebody. It changes the whole tone. It changes the whole conversation. So, like you said, there's so many potential applications. I'd say investigatively, this has hardly even been developed much. Um, and that's definitely been difficult having left law enforcement. Aside from working with the Morin family, it's been very difficult to get investigators on board with trying this, right? Without like a dedicated approach to it where it's like I'm really trying to market it, which I haven't been. It's really just been like, well, let me help this family and then kind of go from there. But I believe in it enough that I think it could be um, a necessary tool in every investigation, pretty much every investigation going forward. If people know how to use it, it can really bring advantage to the investigators, in my experience.
You really are a pioneer, and listening to you today, you should be working with any law enforcement agency, uh, and training them and getting to, and teaching them on these on the behavioral content creation. I think it would be an invaluable resource. I hope the BAU continued it after you left, uh, but it seems like it's something that that any law enforcement agency could benefit from having it in their toolkit.
Yeah, I mean, I my hope is that it'll get to that point. I think there's got to just be proof of concept or demonstration with another law enforcement agency where they can point to it and vouch for it. I so that's my hope in the year ahead that those opportunities start to come up because yeah, I resolutely believe in that. Like once they see it, it's very difficult to make these kind of things safe for the Morin family. And as a person outside law enforcement saying it's an investigative technique though, that it's not something I necessarily always want to shout from the rooftops. But I think yes, given the right opportunity, people would see the value in it, and they certainly did when I was with the BAU. But that could also be because, we were free help to cases where the BAU would fly in and like, we'll help you out with that. It's different. I mean, but I think when I started it, I thought this could be a good side business as well. And I think some of the trying to build it as a business was definitely a challenge for me because I hadn't done that before. And eventually I got to the point where I'm like, you know what? I'm just gonna just do this as a volunteer. And that's eventually when I got connected with the Morin family and just kind of kept it from there. And to me, that experience, even though it's with one family, has still been pretty invaluable to me because I never really spent that kind of time with victims' families before. It was always just kind of like a momentary brief thing, or usually family members who were suspects too. So this was very different in terms of seeing things from their perspective outside of a law enforcement agency.
Well, I'm sure anybody watching right now is hoping that I'll post the videos you've made. So I'm going to post them, and we'll play one at a time. We have 4 set up here that you made for Rachel Morin's family. Before I post that, I'll just give a quick overview of Rachel's case for anybody who's unfamiliar with Rachel's case. Rachel Morin disappeared on August 5th, 2023, while jogging on the Montpaw Heritage Trail in Bel Air, Maryland. She was found deceased the next day on August 6th. and she ultimately, there was an individual arrested, Victor Martinez Hernandez, and he was arrested in Tulsa, and it was found that he had previously committed a crime on March 26, 2023 in Los Angeles. And as Tim mentioned, he had committed another homicide prior to that, back in El Salvador.
I think that's
I
right.
think that's where he committed the other
Yeah.
crime. And so he's on trial right now, and it's in the news right now because he's trying to get a change of location. I don't think he, as I've stated before, I don't think he should get one. I think I think he deserves to be tried in the county where he committed this crime. And Tim will talk a bit more on that in a moment because Tim's been attending the trial. Correct, Tim?
Why the most recent thing was a hearing with a few motions, including a request by his defense attorneys to change the location, and that motion was denied by the judge. So, otherwise, yeah, I've been staying in touch with the family and catching up with them. Mm-hmm.
Great. And I spoke to Matt just a few days ago as well. Matt McMahon, he's the father of Rachel's oldest child. So Tim and I have been in lots of close contact with him, and I've had the privilege of getting to know, as Tim has, other family members of Rachel as well, and we'll meet some of them in these videos. Tim, so this first video is with Rachel Morin's brother. Do you want to tell us a little bit about this video
Sure.
just quickly before I play it?
Yeah, it's the first time I went to the scene of the crime, or where they found Rachel's body, to the tunnel where she was found. And this is, as much as I want to be in the moment in that experience with whoever I'm filming, it is purposeful too that I want to go to a location that has significance for them, emotional significance. And for Michael Morin, came to find out that he had at different times been spending the night in that tunnel where Rachel's body was found. So I knew going to that location and starting to film him and ask him about this he would be in a space of vulnerability and affect for sure. But with the tunnel in particular, there are things that I don't plan for. And you'll see in this video, there's certainly contrast with the light and darkness, and the contrast with the struggle Michael was having with the loss of his sister, and that he wasn't able to protect her, and all these things in her last moments. And that's not always planned, but choosing a location is very important for that stage, for that behavioral content creation, because you want something to be aesthetically pleasing too to people watching it. But in this particular thing, it was dark in the tunnel, and normally I wouldn't like all that kind of grain on the footage, but I was okay with it, and it was a good thing because I think it brought people there. The echo of his voice in the tunnel brought people there. All those things that come off, I think, is authentic to people, and that's really how I wanted to portray Michael, and to give the sense to people watching this of the struggle that he was going through. And this is very different than the content people were seeing in the news, where it was scanning shots of the woods or a reporter talking about something in the mall and paw trail. So it's very different, and that was by design to attract viewers to it.
Okay, let's play this video of Michael.
This is this final resting place of Rachel in this tunnel. Kind of looks like a sewer. I think about her laying here, and I wonder if she was half awake, looking at the light and just saying, I just got to make it to that light. Is she thinking about her kids? Is she thinking about me? Did she feel hopeless here? Think about warm, feeling warm under her head, and then making the connection. That's blood. It's dark. Did she feel alone? It's not think about like what she looked like, you know, beaten or whatever. It's like still pretty. I don't care how dirty, how scary, you know, how she felt. I wish I could feel it for her. And I won't look away. That's kind of why I'm spending so much time in these tunnels, this tunnel specifically.
Okay, so that was Michael Morin, Rachel's brother. I had the privilege of meeting with Michael on my first trip down to Bel Air, Maryland, and Michael took me to that tunnel and walked me through. And as Tim mentioned, he spent nights in that tunnel.
I think another purpose with creating content like this too is, there's a concept in research called thin slices, and that people, even untrained, anyone really, if they just get a thin slice of an impression of someone, they're usually not wrong, actually, when they've tried to study that. And I incorporate that concept when I'm making content, knowing they don't need to know everything about Michael Morin's life. They don't need to know every detail about the case. They can find that elsewhere. Let's just present this guy in this moment and see if people can connect with that. And that could be important later if we're trying to continue to gain and hold the attention of the offender or the offender's family and friends or other people, establishing some kind of connection between a public audience and these people, that they're likable, incredible, and people respond to them. That's important, even if we don't have all those objectives lined out. That's what I'm trying to do, and keep it in a space where people can actually process it. And there's fluency in that processing, right? Keeping it short enough. But that's the background of the design of that kind of content.
I really like that approach.
Yeah, Rachel Morin's sister-in-law. This is Michael Morin's wife. Also, I filmed her in front of the tunnel. Another aspect of this is keeping in mind the audience, even in the consumer approach, to bring them to places they just wouldn't get to see. And you didn't really see this tunnel in news media coverage of it. I think for a long time they didn't know where it was. And I mean, there's a lot of things you can even unpack in that, where it's like, if you're presenting content out there to the public and they see that these are family members and they're in a place that the public doesn't usually get to see, it also suggests there's a level of access there that's unique, right? If I'm making this in a place where they found Rachel, but most of the public doesn't know where that is, all this is still meant to attract people to watch it and hold their attention. But Michael Morin's wife, I mean, she had a lot of things to say about this tunnel and how during COVID they would go and walk to. I can't remember now if it's in this video they talk about it, but there's so much they have to share. And the intention behind cutting it down to like 2 minutes or less, there's a lot of things I have to leave out that would probably be interesting for the public, but does it fit within the kind of content I'm making for the purpose of the consumer approach? Not always. This is another example of, well, let me show another person in the family. I want to present her with depth. I want to present her a thin slice of her so people get to know her. And so I start to build her reputation with people as well. And that was the purpose behind this initial video with her as well.
I agree with you. Shannon was very pleasant. She was very insightful. So let's play this video.
I just knew when they found her car here, I just, in my heart, I knew, I'm like, she's gone. She's gone. Because I'm thinking, even if she got injured, because the trail was left open, somebody would have seen her like on the trail, like, oh, I broke my ankle, or, someone would have seen her. So that, to me, the fact that people, it was open. So we came here immediately. We came here right away. And we're like, let's go look for her. But in my heart, I knew, so, that's not like her. I dropped my husband off. I was going to look with a couple other friends, guys that we knew and stuff like that, who, were like, let's go look for Rachel. And, but her daughter had called and wanted me to get them. They didn't want to be home alone. And so I'm like, okay, then I was going to look, but I'm like, I'll just drop you off and I'll go get the kids and you look. And so I went to get her children, and I will never forget the look on her daughter's face when I came up. And this is before they found her, but she was so scared. She has very blue eyes, and my big blue eyes, and her eyes were so distraught, like just so sad. And it just is one of those images that burns in your brain forever. Like her sad eyes of like, I don't know where my mom is. I don't know if she's okay. That affected me a lot, to see her child so sad.
Well, I haven't watched that video in particular in a little while, but there's a lot packed into those videos. And from one perspective, I may never know if, the alleged victor saw those videos. Maybe he didn't. Maybe it would have no impact on him, but there's something exploratory there too, in terms of being in the actual location, because a lot of offenders do like to visit places where they've assaulted or killed someone, before they're caught, and those places have value for them. And so when I'm crafting behavioral content like that, I'm thinking about that as well. This is something that an offender is probably going to want to see, because since they committed that crime, they have not been back. And what other content is out there that shows that place where they committed that act? So those are things that are hard to know for sure, and or to measure. But I try to craft them in because they could be important. I think the second thing too is, I'm speaking about this with a lot less experience in terms of geographic profiling, but it's interesting, all the elements that are in that video, where it's like you hear the cars in the background. So you have a road, you have a pretty busy road, you have a very long tunnel, you have a tunnel that's out of view of most of the public. And I'm sure for you, all those attributes are starting to shape up a lot potentially about this offender before anyone knew who he was, that they would even know where that is, points of egress and access, all those kind of things that I don't necessarily always think about. And I wasn't making that content with that in mind. But from what I've picked up over time from the things that you shared on podcasts that we've been on together, I can see the value in those things and shaping a profile geographically of an offender and their choices. So it's really interesting when you actually bring people to those locations, what you learn about these unknown offenders.
I can see all that. I completely agree. And, there's something in these videos, and we'll see it again in the next two videos, and it does something to me, and you probably know what it is, but I don't. It's that you haven't edited it like a documentary.
Yeah, sure.
The camera's moving, it's not on a tripod. When you adjust focus, you're not editing that out. I don't know, it does something to me on more of like an emotional level, rather than watching a documentary style editing. And maybe I'm sure it's on purpose, but whatever you're doing, it works.
No, it is usually. I don't know if I'm always conscious of it, because I think it's become a stylistic feature for me that I like to film that way. But what is purposeful is trying to avoid editing. Yeah, because I know a viewer is thinking about those kind of things, and if they are watching something that is clearly not edited, then it makes the person speaking look a little more authentic. Even things as simple as, do you ask them a question and then you leave your question in there? That really can increase the authenticity of someone's response, because it appears a little bit more likely like this wasn't planned, it wasn't staged, they're speaking naturally in response. It is a natural interaction when I'm filming her and asking her things, but it makes a difference in terms of how you present it to the public, to really emphasize that, like, this wasn't edited. So I'm going to include some movement so that people adjust, but they're also paying attention, saying, she just keeps talking, she didn't, this wasn't edited. Yeah, I think people take it to be more authentic, for sure.
It definitely comes off as more authentic. I I really find it effective. So the next video I'll bring up here is with, as I mentioned, Matt McMahon, the father of Rachel's oldest daughter. Tim, what are we looking at in this video?
At this point, this is still before Victor was arrested. Matt had been kind of doing some of his own work, and I don't know if he had also consulted you on this, but he was looking at the closest neighborhoods to the mall and paw trail, and I think theorizing that this killer may have actually lived back here in this neighborhood because of his familiarity with the trail and where he would enter and where he would exit. And so Matt's purpose was to canvass the neighborhood, and he had mixed reactions from people. Of course, people that are willing to talk to him and some that didn't want to talk to him. And I think at that point, the impression I had from him and talking to him is that he was trying to apply a little bit more pressure locally, because based on that theory, he believed at that point some people in this community know more and they haven't come forward for whatever reason, or that there are certain houses that may have had a lot of people who were from outside the US, and that people would have noticed those things and maybe they just hadn't come forward, and that could be important. So this is, I think it's very important also. I thought at the time, to communicate to the offender, you have a very committed and invested family member who's not going to stop. And so I think that's important. I actually think that demonstration is a little bit more effective than, say, a police chief saying, "We will not rest until," yeah, sure, they got to say those things, but seeing family members who won't stop, that's also effective. And I think some of that can influence people. And that's what I was trying to portray in this video.
And that's exactly who Matt was. He was unbelievable,
Yeah.
and still to this day, but he never stopped. He never stopped investigating, speaking with law enforcement, canvassing, and his efforts went a long way to getting to where we are today in Rachel's case.
Well, I'm standing in a neighborhood about a half a mile due east of where Rachel was brutally attacked and murdered. I'm in this neighborhood because, due to the proximity of the attack and the fact that I now know that the suspect likely traveled in an easterly direction after he killed Rachel, this is the prime search area that I'm targeting to try to find clues to the suspect's identity. I've been walking around these homes, handing out flyers, talking to the community, have received some tips from the community that are relayed to the sheriff's department, and just taking notes about what I see. I do feel like answers can be found in this community. So for the next few weeks, I'm just gonna keep walking the streets and keep working it.
Yeah, in that video too, although we were just speculating, I mean, I filmed him on that street by design too, because he thought Victor had stayed there at that point. We wanted Victor to see that he was close. And again, we'll never know. We'll probably never know. Maybe it had no impact. But you got to try and craft things with that intention, because it might have an impact. It might reach a particular kind of person, instead of just picking any random street. Trying to craft that by design is really purposeful and important.
So this last video is with Rachel's mother, Patty Morin.
This video is a little different. I do like to make the content as stylistic as I can at times, and this one I filmed in black and white because I wanted to try something a little bit different. This is definitely an example of the consumer approach. At this point, we have the suspect has been arrested, I believe. I'm trying to remember the timelines. And so, actually, he may not have been. I can't recall now, but at this point. But again, I was trying to show other members of the family, because I had not had any video with Patty Morin yet. And I think when you start to see also things in the media where it's like there's conflicting or contrasting depictions or characterizations of people in the family, or people in the family are fighting, that it can be important to make this kind of content where it's like again, presents someone in the family member in a little bit of a different way. I couldn't be sure at this point either if it's like when they do catch this person, because I think from what I recall, I don't think Victor had been arrested yet, but it was shortly after this, that this could be important still in continuing support in whatever form that is, publicly or from institutions, and trying to find this person, because there's so many people out there who've lost a family member who's missing or been killed. And how do you make these families stand out so people actually pay attention? Well, the attempt is to make unique content that looks good to people too and moves them emotionally, and also try to capture just this whole experience and journey for the family, because I don't know what's going to come next, and to do something a little bit differently. So that's why this one's very different. Much of it is in slow motion and it's in black and white. I think there are other things at play too as I'm watching that again at that time, where it's like I'd started to get a sense of having initial experiences with, I guess, what we'll call the true crime community out there. And I wanted to see what would happen here. And what she was doing was stopping at different points along the trail with different pictures of Rachel, and she would talk about Rachel. And until she got down to the bottom shortly before that area with the tunnel. And it had a lot of feels to it. Like, where people have backgrounds in the Catholic Church, it's almost like a Stations of the Cross walking through it. I saw things I didn't plan on seeing, like law enforcement officers walking with people like that. And I know there's an element of security there, but there's something different about this portrayal of community in this place. It wasn't so important what she said. To me, it was also maybe more important to show how people were treating her. I'm not saying it was a spectacle of media, but I wanted to include media in there because by that point, Patty Morin was becoming more and more vocal. Things were maybe there's more of a political touch to things in terms of like the electoral campaigns. And so I was trying to mute some of that and just show the pain of this woman who lost her daughter. And that's just as important as any other family who's lost someone. And that's really the driving force here. And I think part of that was just me being a filmmaker and trying to do something different, because you can't help but be in those places and interacting with those families, even if it's secondhand, and feeling things and experiencing things. And I think that's what I'm trying to do too, is like share that with the public, rather than not necessarily being a really concentrated approach there towards any kind of goal.
I can see that, and I think it personally, I believe it was, instrumental in this case in many respects. And as you just mentioned, in the media, your content, it was more, it was more, um, it was more emotional, and put people in touch with the family and what they were going through, and appeal to people on a deeper level, as opposed to everything else you saw in the media. We're talking about discussing the unpleasant details of the case, and keeping it in the media that way. But it's on a whole nother level from that. And
Mm.
your content got a lot of reach in that case across the nation and internationally. So I truly believe that it was instrumental in this case.
No, no, thanks for saying that, Doug.
I really
Appreciate
do. Before we end off here, and I appreciate all your time today, Tim.
it. Sure.
It's been a fantastic discussion, and it's really opened my eyes to a lot of what goes on in the in the world of behavioral analysis, and also in the work you do that has gone into Rachel's case. Do you have any insight, or do you have any thoughts on the trial as it's
Yeah.
proceeded, or insights into the suspect's behavior?
I can share some observations. I mean, being at the motions hearing last week, so that's the first time I've seen him in person. I was probably 10 feet away from him for hours because there were so many emotions that were brought up. And this is be a situation where it's like I don't have any baseline for his behavior, so I don't know what's normal. I don't know what I'm seeing, if it's anxiety or other behaviors that suggest anything. But there was one key moment that stuck with me, and it was during one of these explanations. He had an interpreter there, a simultaneous interpreter. I don't know how much English he understands or not, but my impression of his defense team and the public defenders is that they're doing a pretty poor job of motioning for whatever it is that they wanted, and the way they're trying to make arguments and communicate. But seeing them explain this and looking over at him and seeing him nod sometimes, especially for very weak, poorly crafted arguments, um, maybe this doesn't make sense, but what I walked away from was this impression that his demeanor to me was someone who walked into the wrong country at the wrong time, and you've got the wrong guy. Like I didn't take his behavior as antagonistic. I took his demeanor as he's not supposed to be here and a mistake has been made, rather than what is alleged to be that he assaulted and murdered Rachel Morin. And I've seen that kind of behavior before from offenders in other domains like national security cases, where I see someone who should be, I think, displaying nonverbal behaviors, even though those are questionable, nonverbal behaviors of someone who might be having some anxiety or stress, that aren't showing that at all. And it's often my what I would deduce from that is that they're experienced, or they prepared for this, or somehow they rationalized this, that this isn't what's happening to them and they have nothing to worry about. It doesn't make sense to me. So I don't know what to make of that, other than this is someone who doesn't appear that they're going to plead guilty, that they're actually going to go to trial, which surprises me when I hear about cases where there's DNA matches, that someone would toss that gamble. I also walked away from that having no confidence whatsoever in his defense team, that they're going to be able to wage a reasonable defense for him, but just based on the quality of their arguments and these motions. They were such a contrast to the state's attorney because you'd see arguments that were based on actual law and precedent from the state's attorney, and then you'd hear argumentation that was suggestive and like very conversational and odd reference points from the defense team to argue for some kind of motion. A lot of it was contradictory, and you'd see the nonverbal and verbal responses from the judge of confusion, and as much as they were given a chance to make their case. So to me, I took that as that doesn't fare well for him if he's going to go to trial. When he first came in, there was just a lot of back and forth and administrative process of, I don't know everything that was going on, but people are approaching the judge and having discussions up there. And I think they were really trying to iron out rules for this motions hearing. But when he came in, it was very odd, I think, for everyone, and kind of surreal because a lot of people from the family had not seen him in person. And he looked over a few times, and that was odd, not really making eye contact with people. But yeah, this went on for hours, this motions hearing. So that near the end is when I saw him nodding along with the defense attorney. And I can't recall what the argument was, but it was something nonsensical. Seeing that, to me, I'm like, this is someone who's going to signal or display that he's innocent, that had nothing to do with this. That would suggest, and I think when you talk to someone like Matt, his takeaway from that is this is someone who doesn't show remorse. I would have to agree with that. If that's going to be their approach in a situation where there seems to be overwhelming evidence. So those are some of my observations of him. But again, I don't really have any kind of baseline for that. And I don't know also if, you take situations like that where someone hasn't been in that situation before, and we can't always make sense of their behavior. Kind of like when, I'm sure you've seen examples of family members who just lost someone and they don't appear to be displaying any emotions. And a lot of times that's become a problem if like a spouse is killed and their spouse appears to be emotionless, and people tend to be like, they did it. Look at the way they don't even care. They're not even crying or upset. But that's not reliable. There could be a lot of reasons why. So I can't pull too much more from it than those observations, other than this appears to be someone who is going to continue to present this image of I had nothing to do with it.
No, thank you for those observations. I have no experience being to court, attending those trials. It's not something that I have done in my career yet in any cases. So I find that, I find your insight, your observations really interesting, especially in this case, because I was fairly involved in this case. And I've had a couple discussions with Matt, and he reflects some of the things that you mentioned. He's mentioned as well, but I really appreciate that insight.
Sure.
Well, Tim, thank you so much for sharing your journey, experience, and knowledge with all of us. I look forward to having you back on in the future to continue discussing your work in behavioral content, and on cold cases, whether it's a one-on-one or as part of a panel.
Yeah.
And I think you have a lot to bring to the table in any discussion. And I really look forward to seeing more of your content in the future. If you haven't been to Tim's YouTube page, the address is there at storytellers.design. If you're listening in on audio right now, please go visit his page, or you can go find this episode on Surviving the Survivor's second page at STS Talk, so you can view those videos that we went over that Tim has made for Rachel Morin's family. And thank you, STS Nation, for watching and listening in. Tim, any final thoughts?
No, I thank you for having me on here. I appreciate your time. I appreciate everyone listening and your time as well. And I look forward to meeting again, talking again.